And hello, welcome to NodeUp. It's been a long time since we had a NodeUp. I was looking yesterday, and it's been over a year. Oh no, nearly a year since there was a NodeUp. In fact, the last one was 12th of November last year. Bradley did a deep dive on multi-threading with a couple of other people from who were doing Node workers, and there has been movement on that, but we won't be covering that today. What we have today is a special that we're calling Node News, and I have two guests. We were going to have three additional people, but I have two guests here. We're also recording this on video, so we're not going to advertise the video too widely. But if you hunt on YouTube for the NodeUp channel, you'll find the video of this, because we are walking through some news items on a shared screen, and you can see our faces. So I'm going to introduce our guests to start off with. I have Nathan White. So Nathan, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I work over at NodeSource, and I'm one of the solutions architects that's actually out in the field a lot. I've been here for I guess close to 3 years, give or take. I started off as a contractor, so yeah, I've been working with Node since about 2009. First place was over at Learn Boost.
No, Nate's someone that is handy to go to for opinions on Node in the real world, really, because he's out there dealing with large deployments pretty frequently. So he's got a good head for architecture and Node in action. And so we also have Tierney Cyren out here. So you're in New York, I think, Tierney. Now you've moved to New York, is that right?
Yep.
Why don't
Yeah,
you
I just moved to Brooklyn.
introduce yourself and tell folks where they might know you from?
Awesome. Yeah. So I'm a developer advocate at NodeSource. As Rod said, my name's Tierney. I'm a member of the community committee, so top level committee in the Node.js project. I've also contributed to a bunch of the initiatives and working groups in Node.js, and generally try to help out with getting people onboarded to Node.
And people might see you in New York if they go to the meetups over there. Is that right now? You're going to be hanging out at those
Yeah,
places?
I'm definitely going to be trying to engage a lot more around New York City and JavaScript meetups. So going to be heading over to some of the React and Vue and Node JavaScript meetups locally.
There's a lot of activity in New York. Right, so Node News. What we're going to do today is we've got a list of news items that we've collected over the past couple of months. It's not comprehensive, but it's some interesting things that we've gathered that we can talk about, and we're just going to run through them. Hopefully it's informative for you. Hopefully one or two things at least you might consider looking at more information about. But we're going to run through them. There's a lot of Node core focused stuff. We would like to have more Node ecosystem things. So what's happening out there in New Zealand? What interesting modules that people are publishing? You can contribute to that if you go to the NodeUp GitHub repository. So it's let me see, NodeUp, and then it's contribute is the repository. So NodeUp GitHub org, and the repository is contribute. And I have made a issue at the top there. It's issue number 65, and it's asking for news items. So we're going to do another one of these shows hopefully in November, and by then we'll hopefully have more news items to cover. And if you have something that's interesting, please drop it in there. There's no promises that we'll cover your thing, but certainly if you want to contribute things that are interesting to you, then there's a good chance they might be interesting to other people as well. So please drop them in there. So let's launch into our show. What have we got? So I wanted to start off with a roundup of Node releases, because there's been a flurry of releases in the past. Well, actually, not all of it yet, but basically all of October there's a bunch of Node release news. It's one of the biggest months of 2018 for Node releases, and it hasn't finished yet. So we're going to look quickly at the Node release schedule. I thought this would be a good thing to start with, and because some things come out of this that we need to understand. So if we look at the Node release schedule, which is available on GitHub in the Node.js org under the release repo, there is a schedule about Node versions. when they get released, when they get turned into LTS, and then when they get turned into maintenance, and then they get end of life. We're going to be talking about two release lines today, and the background here is interesting. So maybe one of you wants to explain the node release schedule. Do either of you want to take that? Because I have to do this a bit too regularly.
Yeah, go for it, Tierney. We've been kind of both working together with actually a tool that kind of is around this. So I think we both have actually quite a bit of insight, but I'll let Tierney go for it.
Yeah, so the release schedule is based around two different types of releases. There's non-LTS releases and LTS releases. And LTS releases have a lifespan of 3 years. So from the original release date, say for Node 4, it's 4.0.0 to end of life. There's a 3-year life cycle there. And each release line that is an LTS release compared to a non-LTS release will actually go through multiple stages of current as a current release, as an LTS release. And then there's multiple stages in LTS. So there's active LTS and maintenance LTS. And so as time goes on, and these releases are going through their 3-year life cycle, newer LTS releases are actually added. And so that's why this kind of this graph needed to exist, because it seems pretty complex and like, okay, where am I in this chart, and where is this release line in its life cycle? Realistically, it's pretty simple. It's just kind of carbon copy the time and the timeline over multiple releases, and then move that date forward a bit, move that carrot forward to kind of help make sure that larger businesses and people who need a stable version of Node to actually use in production, to make sure they're able to use that and rely on it and know that there's going to be some assurance that it's not just going to fall out under their feet in the next couple of months.
Yeah, and it's for those that are just listening, there is a graphic that we're talking about here. There's available on the release repo in the Node.js org, and it gets updated regularly. And it's basically just the shifting window of these different release types. And so you can see when things drop out of support and when things continue. But it's not straightforward though, is it, Tierney? It's not just a matter of them copying, because there's all these edge cases. Like, is it Node 8 that ends prematurely?
Yes. Yeah. Node 8 is going to actually end in December 2019. It would normally end in April 2020. Wow, that's far out. So it would normally end 4 months later, but one of the dependencies of Node 8 itself is actually OpenSSL, and it's an older OpenSSL version. I believe Node 10, and then later versions are all using OpenSSL 1.1.0 or OpenSSL 1.1.1. I think it's an easier upgrade path there. But older versions are using OpenSSL 1.0.1, which and then like iterations of that, OpenSSL has a weird non-Semvery release system.
Sure does.
But yeah, the one in Node 8 is actually going to go EOL in December 2019, which means we need to kind of end Node support a bit early for that, because we don't want to be shipping an insecure OpenSSL for 3 extra months.
Yeah, it's complicated, and there is a new complication. I'm going to pull this item forward in our schedule, in our agenda here. Nate, do you want to explain this one? Do you have background on this?
I have a little bit of background, but I'll let you.
No, okay.
Go with the gist of it.
Yeah, so on this topic of Node 8 being moved, the end of life being moved forward, there's now a proposal for moving the shift of Node 8 into maintenance mode forward as well. So there's a GitHub issue here. By the way, all these links will be in the show notes if you want to go to nodeup.org. If there's going to be a lot of links today. So there's a proposal by Miles Borens, who does the majority of the work on releasing LTS branches. Unfortunately, we've had trouble getting more people to help with that. So actually keeping Node LTS rolling has not been an easy task. So if that sounds like something you might be interested in doing, then you could put your hand up and maybe learn a bit about that process. But in that vein, keeping Node 8 up to date with the commits that can be backported from Node master has been tricky. So there's a proposal to move the maintenance mode forward to January. So basically end of this year, Node 8 would go into maintenance mode, which is then basically a lower burden of maintenance for the team. So it's security and critical fixes rather than backport as much as possible, as much as practical. So Node 8 is still obviously going to be supported until January 2020 or end of 2019. But this is sort of lowering the burden on the team. So again, if you've got time or interest in that kind of thing, if you're an LTS user, perhaps you're at a company that makes heavy use of LTS, particularly the older ones, and you'd like to see them better supported, there's definitely room. You can contact Miles or Michael Dawson, probably myself. There's the Node.js release repository is a place to have these kinds of discussions. So anyway, that's some news on Node 8. A little bit unfortunate, but that may just have to be the way it is.
It might be worthwhile to talk about the difference between end of life and like maintenance mode and like what does that exactly mean? With them pushing up the maintenance mode, what kind of things would we see in a maintenance mode that may not happen as a result of that kind of shift with 8?
It's a good question, and this has always been hard to explain because it's not. I mean, it is a strict dividing line between LTS, regular LTS, and maintenance LTS. I think it's actually called active LTS and maintenance. So in active LTS, the intention is to be able to backport as much as practical that doesn't break any functionality, doesn't introduce breaking changes, and has been proven safe. So there's this rule about things have to have been in current releases for, I think it's at least 2 weeks. It's possibly more now, for enough of a period of time to prove that they're stable before they can be backported. And these are just minor things. Generally not feature introductions, although there does tend to be these batches of features. So you might see an LTS branch jump in some minor number, so go from 8.10 to 8.11, meaning features were introduced. But features do tend to be a little bit more risky, so there's a little bit more conservative with features. But backporting fixes and improvements, speed improvements, those kinds of things that have been proven stable out in the wild, that are safe to backport, are introduced into active LTS. So that's why in the past, active LTS releases have been fairly regular, but they've certainly slowed down a lot. So this move to pull forward maintenance mode, rather than being a change of policy, it is probably worth seeing as a reflection of reality, which is that not much work is being done on Node 8 at the moment. So Node 8 is effectively being treated like maintenance because there's too few people to keep that active process going. Because the fact is, LTS is not glamorous in terms of open source work. It tends to be work, historically anyway, done by the large companies. So in the beginning, it was NodeSource and IBM that were doing the majority of the LTS work. We started the LTS initiative. Today, a lot of the work falls onto Miles, and Miles is being spread very thin across the Node org. So there's limited bandwidth there.
Okay, so this actually, for me, is like unique, and it does change my understanding and definition, because I thought the maintenance period was something that goes until the end of life of that release. So with this changing, what we're saying is that there's not going to be this active kind of like maintenance mode per se, but we are still going to be supporting it till its end of life.
Technically, it will be maintained.
Or
maintenance means it's going to be maintained. The definition is roughly that it will receive critical fixes. What is it? It's basically critical fixes. So anything security related, anything
security patches.
Yeah, any like if there's a bug that's found in like the URL parser that somebody discovers that a particular path will, it's not necessarily a security problem, but it's a performance problem, or some fundamental bug that gives a wrong result. Those kinds of things will get fixed. But maintenance is definitely where you can definitely trust it as something you can use. That's the intention, is that this thing is solid, it's proven, it's not going to change much. And anything critical that's found will be updated. So definitely, it's absolutely not a recommendation to not use Node 8. Node 8 is very solid. It's just not going to be as actively developed going forward. So Node 10 is the new hotness. Let's jump into Node 10. So this is shuffling my order around, and I don't have a link for this one. Because it's not the end of the month for us now as we're recording this. By the time you're listening to it, there's a good chance that Node 10 is already out, and there's a release announcement on the nodejs.org blog. But Node 10 LTS is coming. So Node 10 has been out for 6 months. LTS is going to be landing, which basically means just the flag is going to be turned on in the Node binary. There's a little thing you can, a little property that says it's in LTS. That's really all it is in a technical sense. So all these features have been out. It's just a matter of switching this on, and then the website will start recommending Node 10 for LTS, and you can start switching to it. So Node 10 is pretty solid. So Nate, why don't you, since I think you've got a good head around what's in Node 10 that people might.
There's a lot of stuff in Node 10, and I think people were starting to kind of like experiment with quite a bit of that with Node 8 and whatnot. I think what we're really seeing is a lot of performance improvement because of what all the work that Google's been doing with V8 and that runtime that we're getting in there, and largely a part of kind of the what we were seeing is kind of a divergence in like TurboFan and Crankshaft with the older releases of V8 that we saw in like Node 8 and 6. And this has kind of officially kind of been polished into a single kind of unified story. And what that means is Google's really kind of been optimizing around modern JavaScript. What we're seeing now is a huge swing with async await instead of callbacks. That kind of goes into some of the experimental features around like FS promises and some of the other, but I believe, isn't that an experimental feature right now?
It is, yeah. FS promises is
yeah. In terms of feature fidelity and upgrading from like Node 8, what we were just talking about, to Node 10, in general, there's very, very few heartaches that I know of. I think the URL, the URL parse is probably the one place where you're going to kind of run into some minor changes. It still kind of works the same way, but it is actually a formal class now, and that a lot of that code has been kind of cleaned up. And I think the one thing that I'm actually kind of curious about. One thing that's neat to see is like HTTP2 now become official within Node 10, and being able to kind of really kind of take advantage of some of those APIs. For me, one of the things that I was curious about is, with Rod here on the line, is with NAPI now becoming an official native add-on, which I've experimented a little bit with, and I actually like. How since you build NAN, how do you feel about that progression, and do you think we're ready for that transition?
Look, NAPI, so that's native API. So it was a this has been a long time in development. Microsoft did a lot of the work on this, and IBM's contributed as well. So it's been shipping with Node for a while, but now it's come out of experimental, and it's official now. So from Node 10 onwards, in fact, I think this stuff is being backported as well. So you can use the same stuff against Node 8 and maybe even Node 6. So it while it was in experimental, it was still being kept up to date. So I think the status is that the API is stable across all active supported versions of Node. So that's a big deal. So the idea with NAPI was that it's a stable C/C++ API and ABI across versions of Node. The theory is that you shouldn't have to recompile your native add-ons when you get a new version of Node or you jump release branches, because that's the current state of play now. If you jump from Node 8 to 10, you've got native add-ons, you'll need to have them recompiled or download new binaries. NAPI is designed to keep that stable. So the hope is that can be stable for many versions, and that the breakages in ABI, that's binary compatibility, will be minimal. So that's a pretty big deal. The API has got a C interface as well as a C++ interface. The transition for NAN users, which is the majority of native add-ons at the moment, are using NAN, which is a stable API interface, not ABI. That's not super straightforward. I don't believe that anyone's invested in making an NAPI layer for NAN, which would be the ideal. But you can consider switching your native add-ons from NAN to NAPI and just use NAPI natively. That would be the recommendation. NAN's not going away anytime soon. It's too heavily used. But yeah, we've got this duality right now. So now's the time, if you're writing native add-ons, now's the time to investigate an API and start switching to it. It's good news. Yeah, that's all I can say about that. The experimental things in Node 10 that people can look out for that are interesting, there's workers. They were introduced during Node 7, I think, was it? No, sorry, Node 9.
Yeah.
And now it's in Node 10. So it's there. I wouldn't use it for anything production because the API is in flux. People are still doing a lot of work on it. But if you look up the API docs for Node, you'll find the workers documentation. So you can use threads to do interesting stuff. We're still, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that we're still in an extremely early phase of experimentation with this. I'm not seeing a ton of examples of people doing novel things. Have either of you guys seen anything interesting?
Yeah. There is. I haven't seen a whole lot, but I mean the one thing that I think is unique to point out is how some of that shared memory works with with the memory structures and the data types, so that instead of like where we could actually fork a child process and actually control that with IPC, but that was like serialized JSON. I think could potentially be performance boosts and some interesting around the computational heavy side with workers that we haven't seen before. I know that I've seen some like rudimentary work or some experimental work going on. I mean, this is like completely bleeding edge around like server-side rendering stuff of actually having kind of like micro rendering of like individual pieces, bringing off thread off the main event loop to kind of making sure that your application is like actually still staying healthy in terms of responding to those requests. But that's the only thing I've kind of seen out there. I don't have an exact link.
I think we, as NodeSource, when in our dealing with customers and providing recommendations, we're still. I mean, workers is experimental, so you probably shouldn't be using it in production anyway. But in terms of recommendations about what to do with it, we're really waiting to see what people are using it for, and then what the implications of those workloads are on deployment models. So, right now you can give a rough the rough guideline for deploying Node is like you multiply the number of processors per CPUs. That has become complicated in the last few years with V8 becoming much more multi-threaded with garbage collection and optimization. Particularly Node 10 does this. So a single process will use more than 100% CPU and now to do a full workload. So it's complicated. Introduce workers into that mix. Sorry, Nate.
Yeah, it's going to go even. Yeah. I've seen I've seen CPUs going over 200%, right, on node processes. So it becomes a way more complicated game in terms of like actually figuring out how do you scale your processes and resource allocation. It's actually kind of there's a lot of research that needs to be done in that area, especially because of its garbage collection.
Yeah, so it's complicated. It's getting more complicated, and so we're waiting to see a lot of this stuff shake out, because V8's still under flux as well. They're still doing changes. So over the next year, we'll see patterns emerge about how people are using workers. We will see V8 start to become a lot more understood, and so there's so many implications for these things that we're still waiting to see shake out.
And one thing I'd like to add to that is when I was in Sweden for Nordic.js, I believe it was Sweden. When I was in Sweden for Nordic.js, I actually had a talk with Anna about workers. And, one of the things, and for what it's worth, Anna did a significant amount of the work that got workers to the place they are now.
No, majority of it, I think. She basically did the basic implementation.
So one of the things, we kind of discussed was there's not a lot of use cases or examples of people going out there and actually using workers. So, to kind of continue evolving them, getting feedback around, what is and isn't working, and what is, a rough edge, or, what's working perfectly. That kind of feedback is super important, super useful to actually getting this feature landed and, having a solid API that is robust. So, if you do have some time and want to play around with that, I highly suggest doing that and kind of sharing that feedback back to the project, to Anna, and for what it's worth, Adelax is her handle almost everywhere.
That's Anna Henningsen.
The project as well. Yep. So yeah, that feedback is super important and super appreciated.
Definitely. Now, another thing that's experimental is the beginnings of promises support in Node 10. Now, this is not the first thing. The first main thing in Node for promises was the util.promisify API, which has been in there for a little while. This new one is in the FS module. There is a whole new block of APIs under fs.promises. So it's in the API docs. It's marked experimental. Again, using this in production, probably not advised. This is under flux. Experimental gives the core team permission to change and break things during a normal stable cycle. So use it your own, buyer beware, basically. But the Promises API is an attempt to take the FS API and make everything promisable. So everything returns promises. The same API. There's a lot of different edge cases where this becomes complicated. It's not just a matter of just wrapping things in promises. So this hasn't been a straightforward effort, and I would expect things to change because this is not easy. But definitely, if you want to start interacting with the core API with promises and not use existing wrapper libraries, have a look at fs.promises. It's in the API docs, and provide feedback. The team would love feedback, would love bug reports. So that's that. Now, Nate, you did mention the URL parser. This is a common theme actually, because it's going to come up a lot more. Let's just quickly cover that. So in the API docs, in the URL doc, there is information about the URL class, and it's the what working group, what WG URL standard. It's basically the URL parser that's in browsers implemented in Node, because that's been one big discrepancy. As browsers got native URL parsers exposed, they are not compatible with Node's URL parser. So this is an attempt to bring them together. And over time, we will see, right now, a de-emphasis on Node's URL parser. Over time, it will be deprecated in some form. It will probably never go away because it's too heavily used by too many things. But the recommendation is to use this new one. I've been using it and I quite like it. It's very ES6. Use getters and that sort of stuff. Like it feels like I'm programming in Java again a bit, like that whole model. But it's solid. It's really solid. So I quite like the fact that it's like the URL parser in Node has been very loose historically. Lots of edge cases because it's so loose. This just really brings it together. Do you guys have experience with this one?
Yeah, it was a little, coming from like, Node, having lots of insight and using, the older version. It took me a little bit to get used to it, especially it felt like overcomplicated. But then when I actually kind of looked at kind of the consistency that it added, especially around kind of like the search parameters and the query strings and that kind of stuff, it all kind of started making sense. I don't recall, but I do think that I ran into some kind of like discrepancy with HTTP request and using or it gets a little funky as far as passing options. I don't think the story is as quite as good as it used to be from Node to the options for like making a request, like a client request. I think, so some of that stuff needs to probably be smoothed out.
One of the interesting things is you can use this class, the URL class. You can actually use the URL search params class as well, which is, I think, is pretty neat, and it's pretty solid too. So URL search params class, you can use that to parse and build query strings. That's quite nice, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway. Let's move on. That's have a look at that. It's definitely going to be the future of Node's URL parsing. It's important to be aware of it. It's now official. This is an official thing, and as we'll see in Node 11, there is moves to make it the de facto standard. The other thing I had on my list of things to note with Node 10 going into LTS, if you're switching to Node 10, there is top-level await apparently in the REPL. I haven't used this myself, but if you use the REPL a lot and you like async await, you can do top-level await, which is pretty nifty if you have APIs that are async. So, bit of fun for the REPL.
Have you done much with async await?
Yeah, I've done a bit. I'm still trying to figure out the optimal patterns for it. Error management is still a concern for me with both promises and async await APIs. Async await certainly makes it easier because errors are first class, unlike promises. You can get that they throw and you have to deal with them. And so I'm still trying to get a handle on best practice patterns myself, but I know there's so much work. People have just jumped on them.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going away, and I think they do make an easier story. It makes code a lot easier to read. I think there's, for me, some of the places, there's a little bit of that foot gun of, I think one of the things that I liked about old, like a quote unquote, I guess it's older JavaScript, right? In the case of like, is that it was easier to see the pattern for asynchronous activity. And especially when you wanted to do parallelization. Yep. So I think of some of the foot gun is that it's really easy where things could be like parallelized that becomes serialized, and it's not obvious to find those things. And then in terms of the patterns of coding, I've found it as far as a little bit challenging to do certain patterns like throttling with promises or async await that I found actually fairly intuitive to do with like a callback architecture. And like certain things like filtering on those and whatnot, like some of those, the first thing I one of those first problems that I ran into was like trying to async a function within a array map, right? And it doesn't do what you obviously think it's going to do. You get basically an array of promises and that are not going to resolve. So then you have to use, just little things that you have to kind of be aware of that, it's just like using anything.
Yeah.
It's strengthening that muscle and kind of becoming more aware of it.
Yeah. But these are, because they're so new, they're new patterns. I'm confident that over time, best practices will emerge. after we've sort of thrashed out
Yeah.
all the edges. So people will push to the extremes of this thing. We will understand where the boundaries are for best practice, and so that will become clear over time, I think. One of my concerns with, and this has been a concern with promises as well, is what you said about making asynchronous activity less obvious. And that, to me, that is one of the beauties of Node and the callback pattern, is that asynchronous activity is first class, and you see it and you have to deal with it. You are forced to deal with asynchronous activity. And I think that's actually a good thing, because it forces you to think about your applications in the way that they are running. But obviously, people have had trouble with the ergonomics of those patterns. And that's clear. I mean, as much as some of us don't like the fact that people have problems with ergonomics, they do. So that's just a fact of life. And so bring in promises. And promises is a way of trying to deal with that. But unfortunately, promises, I think, puts a layer of hiding over the top of asynchronous activity, and it makes you think about it less. Not in all cases, but in many cases where it matters. And then async await does a similar thing, so there's this trade-off between ergonomics and being forced to think of your applications executing in the manner in which they're actually executing. So that's a tricky one to walk, but I think we're figuring that out over time. Anyway, let's not dwell on that one.
I mean, yeah, the one thing that I think is interesting, though, also about that is the fact that, these were things that Node and the Node community kind of, with ES6 and, these new standards from TC39, it was kind of like thrown on our plate. We didn't, I mean, there was a say, there's obviously people that are involved. What do you think of how that relationship is maturing? Does anybody have any insight there, as far as like I know with some of that work there, that there's been I guess more communication? Or
Tierney, why don't you take that one, because I think you've been more connected to that process than I have recently.
Yeah, so there's not actually direct representation of Node.js as Node.js or for Node.js yet. That's a possibility in the not too distant future. But there have been a lot more voices. The first one I remember kind of being aware of at that table was Bradley Meck at GoDaddy, and then kind of from there, more and more voices from Node started kind of participating in TC39, and we started having a more open discourse with TC39 as a body, and then like addressing the needs of Node.js. So Miles Borens, who's the one who's releasing or created the issue for Node 8 and shortening the lifespan, he has actually been going to TC39 on that part of Google, and has been doing a pretty good job, communicating back to the project and kind of being a bridge there for that give and take. Yeah. There's a few others who are also involved. I can't think of them off the top of my head.
Well, one of the obvious ones is Jordan Harband, who's been there for a long time.
Yep.
And he spans those two worlds. So he's been a voice for Node in TC39 for a long time. And I think he's getting now a bigger coalition of people around him as well. So I think, in my opinion, this is my opinion, because I've ranted about this a lot in the past. It hasn't been a good relationship historically. I think ES modules was a wake-up call for everybody, both people on TC39 and people in the Node ecosystem. ES modules is such a terrible story for Node, and we might cover a little bit of it today, but it's been such a hard journey, and it's continuing to bring ES modules to Node, and it's simply from the fact that Node was essentially dismissed in the process of doing it. It's a browser-friendly API. They didn't really prototype it before signing off on it, and Node really got the short end of the stick out of that one. And we don't want to see a repeat of that. I don't think TC39 wants to see a repeat of it, and Node certainly doesn't, because this is super painful for Node. And so that was a wake-up call. And I think for me, there's this before ES modules and after in terms of the relationship with TC39. It's quite positive at the moment, much more representation, but also Node is becoming more of a first-class citizen there in terms of the impact of all these things they do. Let's move on because we've got a fair bit to cover. And I wanted to get to Node 11. So this came out.
By the way, one quick thing I wanted to point out with Node 10 that I did like as a feature is the recursive option for make directory.
Right, that's right. Okay, well, that's actually, maybe we should shuffle that schedule because I did actually have Node 10.12 on the agenda. And let's jump to Node 10.12. Node 10.12.0 came out on the 10th of October. And this is a really big release. There's a lot in here. So it's worth looking up the release notes for Node 10.12. And there's a lot of some really good things, some sort of interesting stuff. But definitely that FS make the recursive is one of the big ones. Benjamin Coe from NPM got that in there. It's sort of hovered around incomplete status for a while. It almost got released in 10.10, then had to get backed out, but now it's in there. And that's basically the make derp, MKDARP module in NPM that is one of the most popular modules. I don't know. Does anyone know the ranking of that one in the download list? It's in the top 10, I think.
Yeah, it's always in the top 10.
That's basically this in Node Core.
The crypto, the pen level.
Yes, so crypto now has a couple of interesting things. It's basically making more use of OpenSSL in the Node API. Traditionally, OpenSSL has always been seen as just a way to get TLS support, but there's more and more demand to use more of the API. So you can do PEM level stuff. You can create key pairs, which is, instead of running OpenSSL on the command line, you could use a Node API if you wanted to make key pairs using all the different key types and also encoding containers. So have a look at the notes for that if you have any reason to make key pairs. What else did I highlight here? Oh, there's a bash completion script. This is really interesting. It's a minor thing, but it's basically --bash completion. And so Node bash completion will give you a bit of bash that you can stick into your profile, your bash profile, that gives you command line completion. Very simple, but it's, we've had NPM's had that for ages. Now Node has it.
I think one of the other significant things that I've started seeing recently from Microsoft is better build support for Windows, and actually a lot of work going on there to kind of improve the story there, including like build times and whatnot.
Right. That brings to the new MSI installer. Why don't you tell us about that, Nate? Because have you looked at this?
I've looked at it, but quite frankly, I have not actually taken it out for a test run yet. But I was actually talking to some of the developers over at Node Interactive, a couple weeks ago, and some of the commitment that they're really kind of pushing forward to kind of making the story better, and also looking at what they can do with libuv to kind of make some of the interactions with Windows a much better story.
Yeah, look, I think Microsoft is one of these unacknowledged champions of Node. They're actually really the big one. They've been around for such a long time in Node, putting in so much work, and it hasn't been obvious. But they have invested a lot in Node to make Windows a first-class citizen. They've propped that up. They have kept it going. But this new thing in Node 10.12, the installer now, the MSI installer, if you download that, there's a prompt now that says automatically install the necessary tools for add-ons, for C and C++ add-ons. Because that's one of the big pains of Windows, is because you don't get GCC natively in it like you might do in OS X and Linux, or at least the GCC command. So this runs a script. It's a chocolatey script. So that's the chocolatey is like brew for Windows, that basically pulls down everything you need. So it'll pull down the VS C++ command line tools, and also Python 2, and put them in the right place so that you can compile native add-ons with your NPM transparently. So this is really good news for Windows users, so they can skip that step on a new machine. Don't have to have Visual Studio. You don't have to manually install the command line tools. You don't have to manually install Python. This will do it for you. So that's a big win. What else have we got?
You're reminding me of the nightmares I had when I was...
When you were a Windows user?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You're reminding me of the nightmares I had when I was trying to learn Node 08 and then 010 on Windows because I didn't have a Mac. I didn't have Linux set up. It was not fun. It was Node SAS was my mortal enemy at that point.
Well, Node SAS because you got to compile.
Total nightmare.
Well, so having native add-ons that download binaries has been a help.
Yep.
And so people have been benefiting from what's the AppVeyor? AppVeyor is like the Travis CI for Windows, although Travis is getting into the Windows business now. So using that to build native add-ons for Windows has been a huge win for native add-on authors and consumers like Node SAS. But this makes it even easier. So I hope this is a win. Let's look at this other one that I had on the list, which is the new event. So you can listen to the process object, go process.on, and listen to multiple resolves. Somebody want to explain what multiple resolves tells you?
Oh wow. Okay. We're going into that. It basically tracks processes that resolve more than once or that are rejected after resolving. So it's kind of like a gatekeeper, you could kind of say. Like I kind of view it back into the pattern that we would see with, like, you wouldn't want to fire a callback multiple times. And this kind of goes into that, at least understanding that, oh, this promise has actually been kind of fired multiple times, or it's been resolved multiple times, so that you can actually kind of track to figure out where that place is at and kind of decide what to do with that. Am I interpreting that correctly, Rod?
Basically, yeah. This event will fire whenever a promise is resolved after it's already been resolved, or resolved after it's been rejected.
Yeah.
So it's basically like a callback firing twice.
I mean, in general, I would say that it would be much better when you have a multiple callback. That's when you use an event emitter pattern. And so this is actually kind of, as we're looking at the tickets, obviously used for as a really kind of a handy debugging tool, because or else it would be really painful to kind of track down these really innocuous bugs that kind of creep into your code.
So on the agenda, I had this big thing about the current state of promises, and this is part of the story. And we might actually skip that till next time, but what I will say is that this is part of a bigger discussion about Node exposing tools for people who want to put boundaries around appropriate promise use. And there is a little bit of an argument about so things. You're allowed to resolve a promise twice. You're allowed to resolve a promise 100 times. That's within the spec. You're also allowed to attach rejection handlers long after the promise has been rejected. That's perfectly within spec. But Node now has these two events. One of them is unhandled rejection, and the other one is multiple resolves. And what they do is basically they say, okay, these things are allowed, but there are reasons why you might want to constrain them. And so as a user, personally, I would like to know if a rejection handler hasn't been attached, but there's been a rejection. That, to me, suggests there might be a bug. And same with this multiple resolves. I would like to use this because it suggests that there may be a bug, because it's not what I would expect from promises in action. So I like these because they provide boundaries around best practices. A lot of people don't, because they say, well, the promises spec allows you to do a whole bunch of things, and you're constraining the spec too much. And so there is a really interesting argument there that I think a lot of people would be interested in hearing. Let's not go into that just now, because let's hold that over till next time.
Have you heard some of the discussion around like async, like basically adding like async functions to event emitters or listeners?
No.
Yeah. That sounds interesting too, right? I'll have to dig up the ticket for you.
Yeah, let's put that on the agenda next time.
Yeah,
Goodness. Yeah. Let's quickly go to Node 11, because Node 11's out. It came out on the 23rd. Tierney, back to the schedule thing. Explain what Node 11 is, what you might want to use it for, and why you might not want to use it.
Yeah, so Node 11 is a kind of intermediary release between LTS releases. So Node 11's lifespan will be about 6 months. It's a good way for us to kind of introduce some of our major changes that were on the back burner in Node 10 and kind of have a place to go and build some additional new features out that might be huge changes. Workers is a good example of this, that we might be able to pull it out of experimental in this lifespan of Node 11. To your point about why and when you should use this, you definitely should be using this for production. It's going to be not long lived. It could be introducing, a bug that, because of the rapid release cycle of it, we're not going to really be holding back in patch versions or minor versions. So it's something that it's more intended to be worked with and developed with locally, and really kind of get a feeling for the new features rather than actually using this for a production deployment. And so for what it's worth, this is also a current release. So in that kind of cycle of LTS and non-LTS, a current release is one that is highly developed. So we're actively working on it. But, the difference between an LTS and a non-LTS is a non-LTS current release, which that's a lot of terminology. A non-LTS current release, at the end of its current lifespan, it will go EOL immediately. And then the next LTS release will become the current release. We have way too many terms in Node. But yeah.
Buyer beware again. current releases have been known to break, and then get fixed very rapidly. I mean, these things, there's a rapid turnaround. But you know, if you're sticking this into production, then you hopefully know what you're doing. So this is an interesting thing with Node major releases that we've had to grapple with, and we still are. The fact is, there's not a lot to talk about when we have this major version increment. Unlike a lot of other projects, because Node follows Semver pretty strictly, most of the new goodness happens within the lifecycle of a major release. So Node 10, we're up to Node 10.12 now, so that's 12 releases that have introduced new features. And each time that's happened, it's been a bunch of new features each time. So you've got to look at the delta between the beginning of Node 10 and the beginning of Node 11 to really see that interesting span of things added. Because when you look at the Node 11 release notes, it's just these minor things, because it's just basically breaking changes that have been held over. And they're all minor. It's not like Node goes around heavily breaking stuff. It doesn't. They're all these tiny little things.
Actually, where I find most interesting is the very first commit for an LTS, where it actually kind of lists out the deprecating changes. It actually kind of talks about the API changes, the notable kind of commits that were in there. And I think in those change logs, the Node release group has done a great job of kind of identifying what is a major change, or what is a minor change and whatnot. So, and then the groupings between, if this is just a documentation change and whatnot. So those are really handy. What are those? How did those categories actually kind of evolve? Rod, like with docs versus like any, those contextual areas as far as around the commits.
Yes, well, so they emerged originally out of the Node commit pattern. So in commits with Node, the summary is always prefixed with the subsystem. That's what it's technically called, I think. So if something touches FS, then it would be the commit would be prefixed with FS : and then the description of what it is. And so every commit in Node, bar some release commits, has this prefix, and it's actually pretty strictly enforced these days. So you can look through and it's got this little prefix. So that really makes it easy for changelogs to group things by FS. On the screen here, I've got the Node 11 release blog post up. And if you look past the notable changes down to the commits, what we do is pull out that that subsystem and then group things by subsystem. So they're not grouped by time; they're grouped by subsystem alphabetically. And you'll see things. Some things span. Like there's one commit here that spans assert and util. That's pretty common. So you'll often see win and build. But often it's like this thing affects child process. This thing affects crypto. And then the nifty thing about that is that you can then strip out, if you want, stuff that impacts tests. So test changes are often not that interesting, and doc changes are another one where it's not that interesting. So if you strip them out, you can then see what's useful and not. The other thing that we do, because we've got these nifty changelog tools that we use in Node Core, is pull out the tags from GitHub associated with the pull requests. And so we can say what's semver major, what's semver minor. So in Node 11, if you look at the commit list, most of them are prefixed with semver major. In fact, are they all? They've been grouped now by semver major, semver minor, and then patch. Not as many patch. There's a few. Most of them are test changes though. So that's a neat grouping. So you can actually see what's breaking and what's not. Semver minor you'll see happen in these Node current releases, like from Node 10.11 to 10.12. You'll see a bunch of semver minor feature introductions. Just doesn't happen that much in Node 10.11. So there's this process of writing. The Node Foundation likes to do big press releases around major things that are happening, and Node 11 is a major thing. But since the beginning, we've struggled to help the foundation come up with marketing messages for these major releases. And Node 11 is particularly the case because it's just not that much to crow about. It's like, yeah, we fixed a bunch of stuff we've been meaning to fix for ages, and now we can finally do it because we can break this tiny little bit. So the headlines, I've got literally 3 headlines that are worth talking about.
It's not.
Sorry, what was that?
Oh, it's just not. It doesn't make for the best marketing material sometimes, right?
Yeah, the best marketing material comes from the LTS deltas. So what is the difference between Node 10 and 8 LTS and 10 LTS? That's the big story, and we've been through that. But there's a ton there.
And that's actually a point I wanted to. That's a point I wanted to hit on earlier when you're talking about like semver major changes. The delta there between when 8 goes LTS and when 10 goes LTS, or when 10 goes LTS and when 12 goes LTS, those are the actual massive set of changes. So everything that's going into Node 11 is going to go into Node 12 and Node 12 LTS. So there's actually closer to 2 major releases, exactly 2 actually, major releases that make it into a new LTS release line. And that's super useful to kind of understand that, even, the major changes that are happening in just this release line aren't the only things that are actually shipping with, an LTS release. There's also the previous LTS release, or previous current release.
Yeah. Yeah. So headlines for Node 11. I've got 3. One is underneath the V8 upgrade. So V8, these days it's been really good. It's because, again, it's like the relationship with TC39. The relationship with V8 has improved, so it's like night and day now. So because Node is important to Google now, Node has become important to the V8 team, and so we have people from the V8 team participating in Node, improving things just for Node, which is just fantastic. One of those things is stability. In the past, we've struggled with this V8 API and ABI breakage constantly. They had the permission because they ran it and they were the only consumers to break stuff constantly. So Node, that's where NaN came from, is the API for native add-ons would break all the time. That happens less frequently now. So we're jumping into Node 11. We're jumping up to V8 7.0 from, I think Node 10 has still got, it's V8 6.8. So we're jumping from 6.8 to 7.
Yep.
Now, that might seem big, but the only reason it's 7.0 is because it's Chrome 70. And there is really not that much that's changed in this release. There are 2 things that, other than there's performance improvements. I mean, TurboFan's getting better. The biggest one, this is the biggest one that comes out of that release, and I'll put it on the screen here. And it's a tweet by Matthias Binans, who's now working with the V8 team. Array sort is now, quote, stable. Um, so what this means is if you apply a sort algorithm to an array, and you've got items that should be equally rated. So, well, the example, he's got an example in his tweet about you're sorting objects, and multiple objects would be sorted at the same point in your array, like they have the same value. Previously, it was difficult to predict how they would end up in the sorted array, so they might get shuffled even though they're equally rated. Now the new sorter algorithm means that they will come out the other side sorted and ordered in the original order where they came in if they were equally ranked. So that's a headline. And the other headline is
Nice.
there's a description property for symbols, which is literally just a alias for toString. That's it. So the V8 upgrade is not as big as it sounds. There's two more things that are on the Node 11 highlights list that are worth mentioning. One is that set interval timers will now continue even after an error has been thrown. And this has been one big difference between Node and browsers that has caught some people. And this is a breaking change, which is why it's been held off to Node 11, because this may be something that you could be relying on this behavior, and now the behavior's changed. So if you do a set interval and you've got a function that runs at a particular interval, in the past, if it errors uncaught in Node, then that interval would stop and it wouldn't keep repeating. But in the browser, it would. Node now does that in Node as of Node 11. Will continue doing it even if you error, so it'll just keep on erroring. But in the past, it would stop. So if people are relying on that, I could imagine the situation where you might rely on it. It's probably not a good idea to, but that's going to be breaking for you. And the other one is this, back to the what working group URL, new URL object. That is now being used as the parser within TLS, HTTP, and HTTPS modules. So every time you pass a URL to one of these core API functions, instead of internally using URL.parse, the old parser, it uses new URL, the class, which is the what working group parser. And this will change behavior if you are used to the less strict parsing of URLs in Node. It's not as drastic as it might seem, because there's actually a fallback in there. So if new URL throws an error, then it will attempt to use URL parse and then just print a warning on the into the standard error. So for now, and that's like a transitional mechanism. So that's basically a signal for you to fix your code, because URL parse is not going to be used in the future. So there's a fallback. So your stuff will still work. You'll probably have a slight performance regression because of that flow, only very, very slight. But it's a signal. If you see that error, it's a signal to fix up URLs to be more to be parsable with the strict parser. And this is one of those areas where the new URL parser is becoming first class. That's all I have for Node 11. So unless you guys have something else for Node 11, let's move on. Nope. Okay. Let's move on to non-core news. We spent a lot of time on this. We've probably been an hour now on Node Core. So let's quickly put some other things in there that are not Node Core. Tierney, why don't you tell us about the Foundation merger proposal? So I'm going to stick a link up to, this will be in the show notes if you're not watching the video. So the Linux Foundation blog, so linuxfoundation.org, has a blog post. I don't know if this is mirrored anywhere else on the Node Foundation blog or Medium or somewhere, but
yeah, I believe this is on Medium as well.
So this was announced.
The Node.js collection on Medium.
This was announced on October 4th. I think, was that coinciding with Node.js Interactive? Oh, October 10th and 12th. Okay, so it was just before.
So it was actually a few days.
Tierney, I suspect a lot of people, this is just under the radar for them because it's just not that important for most people out there that use Node. Why don't you explain the basics of this, what's going on?
Yeah, so right now there's two separate foundations that are kind of somewhat half similar. There's the Node.js Foundation, which is largely focused on Node. There's actually two other umbrella projects in it, Express and libuv, but the majority of the focus is on Node as a project. And so this foundation actually serves as a home for Node.js. We get a lot of help from the Linux Foundation. They contract with the Node Foundation, so we're actually a Linux Foundation project. There's also the JS Foundation. The JS Foundation is formerly the jQuery Foundation and the Dojo Foundation, I believe. They merged to create the JS Foundation. And so the JS Foundation is kind of an umbrella foundation for a bunch of different projects in the ecosystem. There's both projects you've probably heard of and end up using daily, and then projects that you've probably never heard of. But yeah, it's a kind of umbrella org to kind of help sustain certain JavaScript projects in the long term. And so what this announcement was an announcement of intent to merge between the two foundations to create a broader umbrella foundation. And the reason that there was this intent to merge rather than announcing, we're merging, was because feedback is trying to be collected around, cool, we want to do this as the boards. So as the JSF board and as the Node Foundation board, we would like to do this merger thing. What is a structure for this foundation that makes sense for both the projects that are currently in these two foundations and future projects that might want to join this? So we're trying to make sure it's also an attractive thing for not just kind of putting these projects on a shelf and leaving them forever, but also making sure that other projects in the future will want to engage with this foundation and become a part of it.
Right, so there's a lot of work going on to this because this is not a trivial thing at all. Like, this is a really big undertaking.
Yeah.
Let's not dwell on it for now. I think we can cover more of this next time because it's not going to be finished now. There is controversy surrounding it, and there's even controversy amongst us. We could argue about this, but that's not. I just don't think that this is that interesting for most people that use Node. So,
Yep.
If people, sorry, Nate.
For me, it's kind of like just a speed bump. It doesn't impact my day to day, but it was also good to hear. At some of the conferences, how people viewed this, and overall, people are cautiously optimistic. That was kind of the consensus that I took away. I spidey senses went up anytime there's politics or those kind of things involved. But I have hope. But at the same time, as a developer, it doesn't seem to have that much impact on me on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think that's a big takeaway. And the other takeaway I would say, if you're looking at this from the outside, is the Node core team is has very strong opinions about what it wants and needs from the technical side. From the political side, from the corporate side, and so it knows what it wants and what it requires to get its job done. And there's this sort of division between its technical work and the politics. And I think going forward, as this happens, the Node core team is they're just going to ensure that they get what they need out of it. So it's like there's a bunch of opinions about what needs to happen or what should and shouldn't happen. Like, a bunch of people think this shouldn't happen. A bunch of people really want it to happen. But the core team essentially will, if you polled them all, I suspect you would get them all saying, no matter what happens, we're going to advocate for what's good for Node. And that's, whatever structure this corporate thing takes, the Node core team is going to look after Node, and they've sort of got it. They're used to their independence, and they're going to fight for that.
And I'd also like to say I think that expands beyond core. Node is significantly larger than core. There's a bunch of people who contribute to Node in ways that aren't actually to Node.js/Node.
Yeah.
And so, I've been one of those people. I have very few contributions to Node.js/Node. I think my first one was like a change to the README because something was wrong. And then I have like a couple test fixes. from Code and Learns. But I've been a part of the community outside of Node Core, and my experience there has been very much the same. That the same as what you're expressing about Node Core, which is everyone is going to always advocate for what they feel is best for Node as a project, and I think that's one thing that we're all able to come around together. And everything we're doing in the project is because we love Node, and there's no real other motivations there for the most part.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say, we it's common to question each other's motives, but I think everyone involved in this believes that what they're advocating for is going to be better for Node. This is, there's very little reason to be too suspicious of motives here. It's like people just have different visions for what's good for Node, and so that's just how it's going to roll out. Anyway, there's the link I want to leave people with is this Bootstrap repo. Tierney, do you want to explain what this repo is for? I'm just not as up to speed on this stuff. It's it's the Node.js org. Node.js/bootstrap is on GitHub.
Yeah. So github.com/nodejs/bootstrap. It's effectively a group of people from both the JSF and Node.js who are all working quite a bit right now to actually be developing what this foundation, so like the actual structure of it, will look like. So this includes, everything from the top level down to individual projects, down to other kind of minutia. And I realize I kind of framed that as this is for sure going to happen, like what it looks like. This is kind of a very iterative process. The biggest thing right now in this is getting feedback and getting as much feedback as possible. So, this this foundation that we're trying to build, and I don't mean the foundation as a organization, but the foundation for the foundation, the groundwork, is very much up to debate. We want feedback and we want additional work to put into this to make sure it's something that's super accessible and something that everyone can agree on as much as possible. So, there's a lot of debate, as you mentioned, and that is kind of being able to be channeled into this repo and manifest in the way that we can hopefully create a successful, I don't want to say foundation, but foundation for this new kind of joint foundation.
Yeah. And there's public meetings as well, and I was just watching the recording of the first one yesterday. There's another one happening in 2 days from now, which will probably be done by the time people are listening to this. And just discussing things like what's going to be in the bylaws, who gets representation on the board, stuff like that. So that's all. It's because, as Tierney said, it's all up in the air now. That stuff's just on the table. Let's leave it at that. We can do a status update next time. I don't know if this is that interesting. Why don't you, Tierney, give us a quick update on ES modules, because this thing, to be honest, ES modules really taxes my brain, and so I choose not to be very involved in it. All I know is that this is something that people want first class in Node, and it's something that needs to be solved, and it's really difficult. So where are we up to?
Yeah. So, I think I do want to say that a lot of this ties back into the TC39 representation that Node has now. We've been able to make a lot of progress because of that. But right now, we've kind of executed phase one of figuring out what we're doing. And now we've, begun to implement phase two, which is actually going through and exploring how we're going to be implementing ESM. And we've had a few exploratory implementations previously. I know you can load MJS in the REPL, and there's a few other ways you can kind of use it. But this is a group of 30 people who have kind of gone back to the drawing board since those original implementations, and really try to make sure that every single person has a stake, because there are so many different ways that this kind of affects people. Every person who has a stake in this is, making sure their voice is being heard in this process. So phase 2 is actually a super important part of, cool, let's actually go and try to implement this in a few ways that we can kind of grok and swallow. So yeah, and then phase 3 and phase 4 have been defined as well. They're looser than phase 2 at this point because they're a bit in the future. But really, this is just this is the beginning of the actual implementation stuff. This is the harder part that people are going to finally see the end result of how ESM and Node.js might tangibly look once it lands. And again, people don't have a hard time giving feedback on this one.
Yeah.
I'll say that. But feedback and work on this is especially welcome, because it is something that tangibly affects almost everyone in the Node ecosystem. So getting that work done is super important.
Some of the what's worth pointing out here is that the group is extremely diverse in terms of their opinions and their backgrounds, and so that's one of the reasons it's hard. But also that they represent opinions that are out there, and they're very strong opinions about ESM. But this group has been able to come up with some foundations about what they're doing and not doing with Node. And in the plan document I'm reading here, they have agreed to maintain spec compliance with ESM, so don't break the ESM spec just for Node. Browser equivalence. That's sort of a little bit flexible in what that means. And then don't break CommonJS. So people don't want require to be broken. They don't want the CommonJS modules, module exports to be broken in any way, just to make things work with ESM. They're fairly tight constraints, but they're sort of like the lowest. Sorry, you're having some skepticism.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say that's such a distilled way to put all those things. That's a lot. That's a big order to both have spec compliance, don't break CommonJS, and have browser.
Yeah, I mean, there is differences of, not only is there differences of opinion here, but there are technical challenges to actually doing. This is one back to that discussion about TC39. ESM was done in a way that didn't really consider Node. It wasn't done in a conversation with Node, and so there's technical challenges to overcome here. So there's even new proposals in front of TC39, like the dynamic imports. Is it dynamic imports or the dynamic text imports? Whatever it is.
Dynamic imports. Yeah.
Something like that.
And that's actually, we're working with TC39 pretty actively in the Node org to work on that proposal.
And that's a piece that, if we can get that into the language spec, will solve a lot of problems for Node, a lot of technical problems, because a lot of this arguing is about the compromises that must be made to make this technically possible. Anyway, we'll have an update on this next time. I think maybe we'll do some more investigation or bring someone in that is more actively involved. Let's skip on to some other just things from around the web. So I've got a quick one that I thought was quite interesting. Sam Ruby, who's now getting much more involved in Node. He's from Apache fame, works at IBM. He put together a Node embed example. So in his GitHub, it's Ruby S, RUBYS /node-embed, EMBED. It's an example of how you could use Node as a libnode as a embedded thing within a C or C++ application. This is just fascinating to pick if you had a use case for this. There's plenty of reasons you might want to do this. One of the things it does illustrate is the failings of Node, the Node code structure to support this well. And this example is a good way of demonstrating that. So, yeah.
This is exciting stuff. And there are actually, I think it's also worth pointing out that there was at the Collaborator Summit, the Electron team was talking directly about this in some of their run-ins and what they can do to kind of start helping Node Core, be abstracted in a way to make the embeddable story a little bit smoother.
Yeah.
As well. So I think this is going to be an exciting one to watch.
Yeah, definitely. The thing that this illustrates is if you look in the code, then he's actually had to pull out a lot of the code from the Node main file, node.cc. He's had to pull a lot of that out to restructure it just to make this work. So that illustrates that Node needs to be refactored internally to make this work without having to re-implement stuff. You should just have to call it and load it. And he makes the point here that the Node start function, C++ function, he said it's a misnomer. It not only starts Node, but also executes and terminates Node. This is really what an embedder wants. So that's one of the reasons he's done. There's so much code in this example is because he's had to extract that, re-implement it in a way that where you can be in full control of that process. So interesting project if you're into C++ and want to poke around at that. And certainly the Node core team is very interested in feedback from people who are embedding Node. There's a lot of people out there doing it, but the Node core team doesn't hear a lot until something really badly breaks. I think people are just used to having to hack stuff together, but this needs to become a much more first-class story.
There's also an embedders team spinning up right now. Shelly she's the one, Shelly Vore, who presented at the Collaborator Summit that Nate mentioned from the Electron team. I believe she's participating in it. I know Sam Ruby is. I'm fairly confident he is. And then there's a few other people who are also participating. So definitely there's some space kind of building up for that if you do want to come contribute to that.
Yes, absolutely. Moving on, Nate, did you get a chance to look at this best practices repo? Do you want to introduce this?
I've come across this a multitude of times, and I've gone through this. Overall, this is actually a really good resource.
We should mention where it is. So
it's amazing the amount.
It's on what's this guy's name? IO Nathan. Yoni Goldberg. It's on his. So it's I0, I think that is Natan.
Yeah.
And then it's the repo is called Node Best Practices, one word. And I think if you Google for like GitHub Node.js Best Practices, you might find this one. So sorry, Nate, tell us what this is.
Yeah. So it's a overall is in terms of like building your app, some common strategies, even like developer related, like developer ergonomics around like NPM stuff. A lot of great practices around error handling and visibility for debugging. Talking about the difference between operational errors and programming errors. Even aspects around coding styles and I think one of the great things about this project is it does a lot to avoid some of the spiritual debates, but talks about more or less the tools and why you want to use certain things. It is, there is some definitely an opinionated, around like around certain things, but there is if you don't understand those, default to a lot of these best practices here. And, if this is kept up and been modernized, so it also helps with, I think, JavaScript is in this, like, not just Node, but like JavaScript is in a precarious state. There's been a lot of evolution that's happened recently. So what we'll see is like code examples with var still, and wanting, this will help to kind of highlight, using let and const, which it seems obvious now, but like we still got to remember, people are still coming into the community. So this is a great resource in terms of like kind of like lowering that bar of entry and knowing kind of where to go. And one of the things that I think is not completely fleshed out, and it is never, a rock solid story, but I think this is a great place to start, is around the security practices. They do have a great list, kind of an audit checklist.
Yeah.
And some things to kind of just kind of put into your awareness to kind of go through. So, and they talk about like right there that second one, like the rate limiting. They mention express rate limiter. That's great. for smaller projects, but definitely, if you're in a larger organization, these things are going to be moved to like hardware appliances like F5 or Nginx or HA proxy, or even part of your cloud provider. So it's not that you necessarily use the exact tool, but those concepts are kind of fundamental that apply regardless of how you move those in your stack.
That was sort of my takeaway. There's a lot of stuff in here I disagree with, but mostly it's like these are good defaults, and also they're good starting points for learning. We run into these people all the time, particularly like our area is dealing with large companies, and it is not uncommon for us to go into a large company that has just started using Node, and they've just got no idea about best practices on architecture, and having resources like this, I think, is good to get people at least starting to think about best practices. I think this is going to be a burgeoning area in the next year or two, asserting best practices, more collated resources of what to do with Node, not just a Stack Overflow article on somebody's big write-up on one particular area here, but people are doing much more work in collating best practices and publishing them together, pointing people in the right direction. So this is really good to see.
Yeah, I do think it's definitely like this is a great default. There's definitely nuances that come into play depending on the type of work that you're doing, or the particular skill set or patterns, or even take it with a grain of salt, or like look at your use case specifically and see if it does actually apply, that you're not putting like square pegs into round holes.
Yeah. We should move on. I've got a hard stop, so I haven't got much time left. Yeah. And I think that people are probably going to get sick of listening to this if it goes too long. Tierney, was this you that just dropped in the Definitive Node Handbook? Tell us about this. From Free Code Camp.
Yeah, so this is kind of along similar lines. This is actually something that came up in the discussions around the website redesign. This is a really massive guide on using Node.js. From when I started, it very much reminds me of Mixu's Notebook. It's just a tremendously large guide on how to use Node, as a tool itself. And all the kind of things around Node as a platform that you're going to need to know to build things. As you guys were talking a second ago, I was going through this. There's about 50 or 60 different guides here, or parts to this. It's a pretty tremendous article and kind of set of resources. We're actually working with Flavio, who created this, to see if we can use this as a basis for the new guides section of the Node.js website. So hopefully that pulls through. But this is look at your scroll bar on that page. It's not even past the header.
Yeah, it's huge. It is really huge. It looks like it's probably going to be very good for people coming particularly from the browser environment. If you don't know Node, but you know a little bit of JavaScript, this looks like a really good way to launch from there straight into Node, which is, I think there is this misunderstanding that you can just jump from the browser into Node. You can, in the sense that you understand JavaScript and you probably have a handle on basic asynchronous programming, but the model is significantly enough different that there's stuff that you need to get your head around, and this seems like a good resource to do that. It's very impressive. Okay, moving on. I did want to mention briefly zero-cost stack traces. This is something that's coming up, and this comes out of the relationship that Node now has with the V8 team. Benedict Muir, he was the primary person responsible for TurboFan. He's actually taken a lot of responsibility in. I think he's something like one of the Node leads within the V8 team. Like he is looking at Node performance. V8 performance as it applies to Node. So he's very interested in this stuff. Asynchronous stack traces are stack traces can be a pain for people doing asynchronous work. Always have been. When you jump the asynchronous boundary and you have it, and then you create a stack trace, you'll often just not get enough information. Sometimes it's completely useless. Doesn't tell you anything. in V8 in DevTools, Chrome DevTools, they do have a mechanism by which you can get asynchronous stack traces, but you have to have the inspector turned on and it slows everything down, and you have to be debugging it. You don't just get them on the console naturally.
I think it's important to note that this has been a problem even with callbacks.
Oh yeah.
Been, Trevor's work with async hooks actually helps to remedy that. There's also other libraries out there, but yeah, this is amazing.
The big deal here is zero cost. They're aiming for zero cost, and there's a document I've linked to by them. It's a Google Doc they're maintaining. So Benedict and Yang Yuo, who they're both very core V8 members who they understand this stuff way better than most people. The emphasis here is on zero cost, because what they're doing is reusing the metadata already available, and so these asynchronous work as it happens across the boundary. Now that promises has become the asynchronous primitive with async await, there's a bunch of metadata where promises attach to each other, and you can actually pull out a lot of the stack trace, except in certain situations. And this document goes into a lot of detail about where that's possible and where it's not, and then some of their there's so much detail in here. If you want to know about how promises work under the hood, you just read this thing and you'll get an idea for how it works in V8 at least. And then they're looking at how they can just restructure things a little bit internally in V8 to get better metadata in all situations where it matters, and then use that to make these asynchronous stack traces where you can see the frames of the different asynchronous work as it's happened leading up to where the error or where the stack trace is generated. So have a look at that in the show notes. So how about we end on this one? This is a really interesting one for me. This next topic, which is I've titled it Package Manager Experiments, and let's start off with this blog post from NPM that came out. Was it late last month? It was late September, I think it was. Oh, maybe it was early October. Anyway, regardless. So NPM announced this thing that was initially called Crux, C-R-U-X, and it was renamed to Tink, T-I-N-K. So if you look up Tink in NPM, you'll find this thing. Now, this is NPM experimenting with essentially an installer that doesn't install. Technically, it doesn't install. So it's like it's sort of like a node runner that skips the entire step of NPM install. And it will use your package lock.json, because there's tons of information in there about the packages that are being used, and it will then look them up in the packages you already have downloaded in your NPM cache. So this is for now it's a proof of concept. If you go to the project, you'll see that it's pretty immature. You can use it, you can run it now, but it's very early stage. So the day after NPM announced this, the Yarn team went public with an RFC. They go through this RFC process for major changes. Now the timing is really interesting. This is something fascinating I haven't been able to get to the bottom of yet. So this is okay. September the 13th. So the NPM one was September the 12th, I think it was, and this was announced by Yarn on September the 13th. And neither of these are trivial. So they've both been working on these a fair bit in private. Like this RFC for Yarn is huge, and the Tink project has got a lot of code. So I don't know whether one saw the other and announced, and by the date it would suggest that NPM went first and then Yarn saw it, and then so went public with theirs. But they're essentially experimenting with a very similar area, which is getting rid of node modules, node underscore modules, or at least being able to run node without having a full node modules directory. So Yarn plug and play is actually implemented now in Yarn 1.12.0. I think there's 0.1 now, but these are release candidates. So the current stable version of Yarn is 1.11. This stuff is in 1.12. I assume that will become stable soon. The activity suggests that this stuff has just basically gone through all of Yarn now, and you can use it on all platforms, even Windows. I saw John David Dalton contributed the Windows version of it. I don't know how that guy gets so much done, but Anyway, so Yarn plug and play, you can use this thing. It's not a separate tool. It's actually just Yarn, and you use Yarn, and I think it's --PNP. And this takes the approach of, it doesn't use package lock because Yarn uses its own Yarn lock, but it doesn't use that. It makes a .pnp.js file, which is essentially a module resolver. So then when you Yarn run, I haven't played with this, so this is off the top of my head, and I'd love to hear feedback about this. When you do Yarn run, it then intercepts all of your requires, passes it through this resolver, which then looks up where it is on the file system, because Yarn maintains its own huge cache. And so Facebook have been doing this internally. This has come from internal Facebook work, and they reckon that they can installs run using plug and play are up to 70% faster than regular ones. That's and NPM is saying a similar thing, where if you've got the cache that's primed, this is just a trivial matter of just creating those linkages. They don't use symlinks, they use this resolver file, and they've got a whole lot of stuff in there about why they do that. Now, there is this thing where tink you can override its use of package lock by putting something in your node modules directory. So if you have something in your node modules directory, I think tink will use that first instead of resolving a different location. Yarn has this thing called unplug, where you can do yarn unplug for a module and it will install it locally. But then it doesn't go into node modules, it goes into this .pnp directory. So the summary here is that these guys they're both experimenting with new approaches to package management. And this is very early days, but I think that this is definitely an area to watch, because there's a lot of potential here to do some really interesting things. Either of you had a play with this or have any thoughts on this?
I just superficially poked and watched at some of this stuff. I think it's actually, like you said, it's interesting to watch. I think there's a lot of room for improvement, especially if you kind of look at Ryan Dahl's talk about the 10 things he regrets about Node. A lot of them actually focus around the package management. So this could be an area that kind of is poised to kind of help solve some of those problems. One of the things I kind of thought of too is PKG is another tool that I think of in terms of kind of removing node modules out of the picture, but that's a little bit different. Kind of packages everything up as a monolith with the runtime, which is pretty.
So,
I was just gonna say, I've not had a chance to play with either of these yet, but the biggest thing that these kind of make me think about is, what this is gonna mean for Node.js is, in a longer term sense. It'd be great to be able to remove or npm as a dependency in Node core, and take that out of our uncheck it from GitHub or uncheck it from Git. But yeah, there's this opens up some interesting avenues for Node that we've not really had as an option before.
Yeah.
So
it does, yes. And so the big picture here for me is that this is exciting because people are thinking bigger. This is a sign that people are thinking beyond the constraints we have now. There has been a lot of obsession about internal stuff, and maybe that's just my perspective on things because I'm so much more focused on core. But this is really big picture, looking forward into sort of jumping over what is possible now into what could be possible in the future. So I'm excited, particularly from NPM actually, to see this, because NPM has been very focused on sort of just improving incrementally what they have. This is a really big jump. And I want to highlight that with the last paragraph of the blog post that NPM put out, which is really interesting. So tink is an opportunity to change how we relate to our Node.js projects and the NPM registry. Should using require or import on a module not in your package JSON just add it to your package JSON? Should extremely popular features like Babel compatible ESM, TypeScript, or JSX be available by default? These are questions we've been asking ourselves, and we'd love to hear what you want from a next generation experience. That's big thinking, and I have strong opinions about some of these things, but the fact that we're entering into a place where we can discuss this stuff and make better user experiences for people. And this could be something where it multiplies into, there's the front end experience with Node, or maybe there's the React experience with Node. You've got a React Node runner that does all of this stuff. It's all about user ergonomics, and there's so many, because Node is used in so many different ways. This has got avenues for multiplying that. Anyway, so we're running out of time. I want to skip over some of these things, and let's do. So I had this. I thought we could do mention some random projects. In the old days of NodeUp, we used to say, what was it? Personal plugs. So do your plugs, and so this is like doing plugs now, but it's let's look at some projects that are interesting for us. Tierney, you had one that you want to highlight, and it actually it comes from work that both you and Nate have done together. So let's talk about that.
Yep. Yeah, so this is Node release lines. This is a project that Nate and I have been working on together for a while now. He did most of the heavy lifting with the data, and I've been mostly building out the CLI stuff. So yeah, this is basically a way to consume a lot of information about Node. So everything from change logs to release information to Node core vulnerability information as a module, and then you can also use it as a CLI. And so I built out a few kind of different CLI. Hold on, sorry. I built out a few different CLI commands, like is Node safe, just to tell you if the currently running version of Node is safe, or to check if a specific version is safe, or to exit in CI if the version you're building with is unsafe.
Yeah, that's a good one. So is Node safe --CI
Yep.
is really neat. So you could stick that into your CI flow, and if you are deploying with a version of Node so that comes from the CVE database that is maintained on the Node security working group repo, I assume?
Yeah,
Yep.
It does. It wasn't the easiest place to get the data because it's like all in those individual JSON files, but that's what this whole project is kind of designed around, is pulling in all that information. I think the key thing right now is this is kind of designed in an offline, so it's a little bit to kind of keep it up to date is, as Tierney has found a little bit painful. The next feature, or kind of the major 2.0 release, will be full online support with like a caching mechanism.
Oh, nice.
So all that stuff will.
So you don't have to upgrade it every time.
So then it will kind of. Yeah, exactly.
That's neat. There's a lot of potential here because there's so many sources. What are the? Let's talk about the sources quickly. You're pulling from the.
So it uses the Node.js release repo that we actually talked about earlier for the schedule.json to actually pull in the LTS schedule, and actually the schedule for all releases, right? And even the code names. And then from there we pull in, I actually was inspired by your tool, Rod, which was, it goes into the, there's a, for all the releases or all the publication, there's a JSON file that has all the release information, all the metadata about all the releases, every single individual release, which has like the versioning of like V8, and it has some other kind of interesting metadata in there. What we've done is kind of glued all that stuff together, including parsing the changelog files that are in the Node core repo as well, and getting the commit logs and kind of the messages, and attempting to kind of, Tierney actually has another command line tool that's in there. It's being held off until we fix 1 or 2 bugs. But
Yep.
yeah, so the idea here is to actually kind of give you a quick and sane approach to kind of distill and to kind of introspect everything around Node, and around the Node release lines, right?
Yeah, as you said, there's disparate information. I think the intention with the technical team's work around all this data is that they wanted to make this stuff available with the assumption that people would then consume it and put it together in much more useful ways for users. So companies could take it and build it into their products. This kind of stuff can be built. So this is really good to see, so that you can start consuming it. So it's on GitHub. Under Nate, your GitHub username, which is NW, and the project is node-release lines, node-release-lines. So you can npm install node-release-lines.
I mean, this is really a brainchild of Tierney. As you can see, I think one of the coolest features that hasn't actually been highlighted too much is around how many days are left in a support cycle,
right.
Or when a release is going to be coming out, and those kind of things. And then, I mean, Tierney actually has done a lot of work with regards to the command line tools of telling you, hey, your version is insecure. Here's the most recent version, or the oldest version. Here's the least upgrade that you can do to actually have a secured, version of Node.
So I have a child at the door telling me it's time to go. So,
okay, all right. Sounds good.
Okay. So look, I might wrap it up there. I might skip mine, and we'll do it next time. So let's leave it at that. So in its closing words, let's I'll remind people that as at the top of the show, I mentioned that you could contribute to this, to what we do next time. Hopefully, we'll do one next month. Tell us what's newsy out there. You could plug your projects, but we're not committing to reading everything that you put in there. But if we think it's interesting for a general audience, we might do it. So stick it in the GitHub repo under the org NodeUp, one word. The repo is contribute, so /NodeUp/contribute, and then in issue number 65 I've made for November. Stick some things in there, and yeah, we might talk about them next time. So let's wrap up for now. Thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks so much, Tierney and Nate, for joining us. Hopefully we will have our extra party at least one more next time. And this has been fun. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. Please give us feedback if you like this. Let us know what kinds of things you'd like to hear about, and we will try and put it together for you. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.